In the year 238, 6 men claimed they were the rightful emperor of Rome. Maximinus Thrax was from the province of Thracia, and was considered a barbarian, though whether he was from a family of provincials or actually from outside the empire is hard to say. According to most accounts, he was also menacingly tall and physically powerful. He was made emperor by the army after Severus Alexander, the last of the Severan dynasty, was murdered by his own soldiers. The year 238 was actually his 3rd year as emperor of Rome, and yet he still hadn't stepped foot in the city. That didn't matter though. His power was secure in the military itself. The Senate hated him because he wasn't of senatorial rank or likely part of high society at all, but they were under no illusion that true authority in the empire came from the army. That's how the Severans came to power, and as soon as it seemed they were forgetting it, their dynasty was toppled. Now this institution, which was once the pride of the city, was a faraway drain on the treasury which constantly demanded more pay raises. Maximinus Thrax, in a way, was the purest distillation of everything the senatorial elite despised. And yet, most went along with recognizing him because the military loved him for the exact same reason the senators hated him. He was one of them. He was well known and liked by the soldiers. A tough but fair man who knew what needed to be done on the frontiers more than any mama's boy ever could. According to himself, anyway. He immediately cemented this perception by going back to war on the frontier and shutting down coup attempts brutally. Whether or not he was any more or less oppressive than other emperors is difficult to say, but he was terrible at making anyone, except possibly the military, like his policies of taxation and confiscations. Policies that were far from unprecedented, but undertaken with none of the political savvy that the Roman elite were familiarized with. The Senate could try to fight back, but that would mean antagonizing the military, the very force keeping the barbarians away, and people who were very willing to kill fellow Romans. There's no way they would do that. Turns out, there is a limit at which they would. While there were multiple minor attempts at coups or rebellions, the big one would start on the foundations of a bygone empire. While you may be familiar with the tale of the destruction of Carthage after the final Punic War, the truth is that Carthage became a trading powerhouse for good reason. Its strategic location for trade on the Mediterranean and relatively easy to defend fertile lands thanks to the Sahara Desert made it a pretty nice place to be, especially during the first centuries of the Principate. This lended itself to an accumulation of wealth for an elite who were also generally popular with the people, as the personal wealth accrued was often dedicated to public works, such as this massive Colosseum-esque amphitheater in Thysdrus, built in this same century. It also helped that the founder of the Severan dynasty was born in this same province, so imperial favoritism was likely at play. This made it an incredibly important province for Maximinus's plans to fund his increasingly expensive military expeditions. People were getting upset, and a powder keg began to fill. It didn't help that the procurator was especially harsh here, which may explain his decision to convict a handful of young men of relatively minor crimes, that is, relative to treason, in order to confiscate some of their property. Maximinus was going to take their wealth, with the strong possibility of ruining their social lives and futures in the process. Now, while they still had their money and connections, was the chance to do something about this barbarian, so they went to the governor Gordian. Gordian was randomly selected among the Senate not too long before 238 after likely serving as consul in the past, possibly even twice. Because of this, he wasn't exactly an imperial representative, but of the Senate. How much that distinction matters depends a lot on the situation, but it matters a lot here, because Maximinus had also sent a procurator whom Gordian had private disagreements with. On top of that, he was also relatively liked among people in the province, and possibly even more important, liked in the Senate, which could help them turn this pesky little rebellion into an all-out civil war. Elevating him to the purple was the best chance these convicts had to change things for the better. For themselves, anyway. One problem, Gordian was 80 years old and could drop dead at any moment. So his relatively unknown son was made co-emperor with him, which wasn't rare at this time as a way to make managing the empire easier and securing succession. It was also a way to have someone actively lead armies in the rebellion instead of sitting around trying not to die of natural causes. Hence, Gordian I and II were proclaimed emperor by a local mob joined by some local troops who soon gained control of the city of Carthage. Still a major city in its own right, which gave them a decent start. The old Gordian is said to have protested the whole thing, but thought that if he were to die anyway, might as well do so as emperor. As previously mentioned, the goal was to turn this rebellion into a civil war, so they quickly sent letters all over the empire promising to restore justice, end the harsh oppression, and promised the most pay that any claimant ever had to the Praetorian Guard. For those of you who aren't aware, the Praetorian Guard were the imperial guards who had become kingmakers in their own right. The people with weapons who tended to operate in conspiracy and intrigue due to their proximity to the emperor and other elite. They had simultaneously made themselves crucial to an emperor's control over the capital city in particular, while also becoming one of their biggest threats. He also promised many other things to many senators and governors in an attempt to gain support anywhere he could. Importantly, they also sent representatives to Rome, one of whom may have been the future Emperor Valerianus. They then killed the Praetorian prefect, the head of the guard who had become the governor of the city in the emperor's absence, and was loyal to Maximinus. This then started a massive riot in the city. People weren't sure why the prefect was killed, nor who did it. Some people thought it was another Maximinus purge, and some thought that Maximinus himself was also dead. It was chaos, and the Senate were then presented with a decision to make, with not much time to make it. Do they support the Gordians, or do they stick to their recognition of Maximinus? They decided to recognize the Gordians. Here's the problem. The Gordians were already dead. Yeah, turns out the Senate made the worst possible decision. The exact order of events is difficult to tell, especially if you were alive at the time, but it's possible that the Senate had given the Gordians their imperial titles while they were already dead. This is what happened. In the Gordians' attempts to secure themselves before the Senate made a decision, they sent an envoy to Numidia, in order to dismiss the governor Capellianus, who was appointed directly by Maximinus, unlike Gordian. This decision is quite baffling to me. First of all, this was supposedly done before the Gordians received word of the Senate's decision, so his legitimacy was paper-thin. Second, Capellianus was in command of a legion, not a ragtag group of armed city guards and whoever else the Gordians recruited, but a legion. Even considering they weren't up to the same standard as those under Maximinus's direct command, they were still experienced and trained. Third, the governor apparently had personal beef with Gordian because of a, quote, legal issue. There was no way that this governor wouldn't try to take these rebels down, let alone roll over and leave. So Capellianus and his legion marched over to Carthage and defeated Gordian II's army, killing him in the process. Gordian I was soon to follow, or was maybe ahead of him. Again, unclear timeline. Gordian I hanged himself. Then, Capellianus did what all good Romans do to other Romans. He plundered and killed and stole from citizens' homes, places of worship, and especially the palaces of men who would dare support the illegitimate Gordians. At least if you trust Herodian's account, who really disliked Maximinus. It may not have been that indiscriminate. Back in Rome, the Senate learned about the fate of the Gordians and verified it wasn't another rumor from the mob. Unfortunately, the scary giant was already slowly making his way to the capital with a couple of German allies he had made, and a whoops my bad wouldn't cut it. He was about to make his first visit to Rome as emperor, a bloody one, and if the Senate didn't pull themselves together, they were first on the list. The Senate quickly chose two more men to serve as co-emperors, those being Pupienus, whom ancient sources refer to as Maximus, but that makes things confusing. You know, Maximinus. Anyway, and Balbinus. Why they chose co-emperors in this instance instead of a sole emperor is hotly debated. The vote itself was done in a temple in secret, so the reasons were also murky to non-senators at the time. Here's a list of possibilities. 1. They were trying to restore some sort of republicanism by having two in the consular style, allowing them to check on each other's power and restoring more power to the Senate in the process. 2. They wanted to split the tasks by having one in charge of managing the city, or at least trying to, I'll get to why that was prescient in a moment, and another organizing a response to Maximinus. 3. They represented two factions in the Senate, one of a more noble lineage and aristocratic stock, and the faction of newer senators who were gradually promoted to senatorial rank. Regardless of the reason, this was not quite satisfactory. You see, Rome had descended into chaos throughout all this. The Senate didn't even really have control of the city alone, and their failed bet for the Gordians didn't help matters, considering the population was whipped up into a frenzy, damning Maximinus and celebrating the Gordians. Also, the people of Rome particularly did not like Pupienus. To mitigate some of the anger, Gordian I's grandson, not Gordian II's child, but his sister's, was found as he was already living in Rome and proclaimed Caesar, the heir. He was barely a teenager. To make a long story short, as Maximinus reached Italy, Pupienus headed out with levied troops of whoever he could muster to fight Maximinus, while a unit of the Praetorian Guard attacked Rome itself repeatedly, defended by the people of the city with Balbinus as their administrator. Not that there was much he could do. Turns out Pupienus didn't have to do much either, because Maximinus got stuck sieging the city of Aquileia and was soon after murdered by specifically Italian troops, and his head was sent to Pupienus before it was sent to Rome. So in a great anticlimax, the Senate won. Pupienus came back a hero, and the empire had 2 emperors and an heir, none of whom were related to each other, and none so far having proven their worth as emperors. Surprise, the 2 co-emperors don't get along. Not only that, but the Praetorians were worried that they were going to be displaced. Whether or not these were the same people who fought against the Senate earlier is unclear, but whether they were or weren't just under Maximinus' command, they were probably right. Pupienus was actually informed that a coup was brewing, so tried to warn Balbinus, but the latter was convinced it was a trick to get Balbinus killed. In the end, they were both dragged naked to a torture chamber by the guard before murdering them and proclaiming Gordian III sole emperor at the age of 13. And that is who would remain emperor as the year 238 CE came to an end: a child. The 2nd century is low on surviving accounts. Herodian's, the one I just uncritically narrated, ends at this point. It's likely contemporaneous, and it's not always consistent with other sources. For example, Zosimus claimed the Gordians died shipwrecked on their way to Rome, and Pupienus and Balbinus were chosen to administer the city until they arrived. While this may make Gordian III's ascension make more sense, kinda, it's not generally accepted. There's also a few that claim Pupienus died in battle against Maximinus at Aquileia, thus making him come back a more legitimate hero. This one is harder to find evidence for or against, especially since his reign didn't last much longer after this, though I guess that's also why it doesn't really matter. At times, Herodian isn't even consistent with himself, but I trust it more than other ancient sources when it comes to the key events. He was a writer who could not escape his own bias and clearly had moral lessons and themes in his history, despite explicitly promising not to include any. This article, along with my reading of his work, has convinced me that his goal was to push a general and shallow analysis on power and authority in the Principate. This year is when that theme becomes clearest, as it is when these ideas were put to the test. The balance of power between the military, the Senate or the nobility, and the people was demonstrated, and only someone who could balance these successfully could become a good emperor. This is why the histories may omit certain facts or make up speeches. It furthers his worldview. And in this worldview, Rome is the center of the empire. Another factor in an emperor's success is that he must go to the city of Rome. He must have some connection to the nobility. Whether this is because noble blood is intrinsically important, or it's a more practical idea of politics at the time, is up for you to decide. The idea that any city in the empire could replace Rome is proven false by the failed attempts. Maximinus was a barbarian who tried to rule Rome away from Rome and failed. The first Gordian tried to rule from Carthage, using imperial authority before he even got confirmation from the Senate, and it was a fumble so bad it led to him ending his own life with a belt. But Herodian was wrong. His narrative likely omits details and potentially fabricates others in order to make his point, so it shouldn't be so shocking that his takeaways are inaccurate, but it's still built in his view. I don't believe he made it in order to mislead. The reason it's wrong is because he was wrong. He didn't make predictions, and we don't know what they would have been. What he was wrong about was the importance of the Senate and of the city of Rome. The main change that the 3rd century produced in Rome was the almost complete separation of the city and the empire. The city would still remain significant, but more spiritually than practically. I mean, Herodian wrote his histories in Greek. He writes of the Osronian and Armenian archers, Moroccan javelin men, the German troops which at first were with Maximinus before joining Pupienus. Emperors would continue to rule the empire from the barracks, occasionally ruling in Rome, but not staying for long. By the end of the century, the administration would be centered in multiple different cities, split up depending on who was in charge and how it was split. The next great dynasty would even found a new Rome, a likely unthinkable prospect to Herodian. Rome was getting bigger than Rome, and that's what makes the year 238 so interesting. It's the city's institutions being spread out over an empire and being overstretched. I don't think that this necessarily caused the decline of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. There are just too many other factors to consider, but it sure is interesting. And in 238, something else occurred which Herodian didn't write about, and likely wouldn't have even known about. The city of Histria was sacked, and a war had begun in the east against a new force, one which wouldn't go away anytime soon. But that's a story for another time.